Hey everyone, tonight we're saddling up for a journey into one of America's most romanticized yet brutally misunderstood chapters. The life of the Wild West cowboy. Those weathered heroes of dust and leather who supposedly rode free across endless plains, living by their own code under boundless skies. Hollywood painted them as rugged individualists, noble outlaws, and masters of their own destiny. But strip away the mythology, peel back the layers of dime store novels and silver screen fantasies, and you'll find a reality so harsh it would make a modern minimum wage worker weep with gratitude. So before we dive into this tale of sweat, suffering, and shattered dreams, take a moment to hit that like button if you enjoy what we do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what your biggest misconception about cowboy life was. Now settle in, maybe grab something warm to drink, because we're about to explore a world where romance went to die, and survival was measured in blisters, saddle sores, and prayers that tomorrow wouldn't be worse than today. When you picture the American cowboy, your mind probably conjures images of sunset silhouettes against purple mesas, campfires crackling under star-drunk skies, and freedom stretching endlessly in every direction. The reality was considerably less poetic. Picture instead spending 18 hours a day breathing dust so thick it coated your lungs, your throat, your very soul. Imagine eating the same monotonous slop for months on end while your body slowly fell apart from the inside out. The truth is, being a cowboy wasn't an adventure. It was industrial labour disguised as romance, back-breaking work performed by desperate men who had few other options in life. The golden age of the American cowboy lasted roughly from the end of the Civil War to the 1890s, a brief window of about 30 years. During this period, millions of cattle roamed the open ranges of Texas, Kansas, Nebraska and beyond, waiting to be driven north to railroad towns where they could be shipped to eastern markets. It sounds simple enough. Drive cattle from point A to point B, collect your wages, ride into the sunset. But the devil, as always, lived in the details. And those details were absolutely hellish. Most cowboys weren't the grizzled, independent frontiersmen of legend. They were young men, often teenagers, frequently broke, usually running from something or someone. Many were Civil War veterans, both Union and Confederate, who found themselves adrift in a post-war economy that had little use for their particular skills in violence and endurance. Others were immigrants, freed slaves, or simply farm boys who'd heard tales of easy money and adventure on the range. What they found instead was a job that would break their bodies, drain their spirits, and leave them old before their time. The work began before dawn and didn't end until well after dark. A typical day on a cattle drive started at 4 a.m. when the cook, universally known as Cookie, would bang pots and holler the men awake. There was no snooze button on the frontier. You rolled out of your bedroll, shook the scorpions out of your boots, assuming you were lucky enough to own boots, and prepared for another day of misery. Breakfast was usually beans, hardtack, and coffee so strong it could strip paint. If you were fortunate, there might be some salt pork or bacon grease to add flavour to the monotony. Then came the real work. Cattle drives weren't leisurely strolls through scenic countryside. They were grueling migrations covering hundreds of miles with 2,000 to 3,000 head of ornery, half-wild longhorn cattle that would rather trample you than follow your directions. These weren't the docile dairy cows you might see in pastoral paintings. Longhorns were essentially four-legged weapons, sporting horn spans that could reach 7 feet from tip to tip, and temperaments that made angry bulls look like house cats. Managing these beasts required constant vigilance and no small amount of courage. Cowboys rode in specific positions around the herd, each with its own particular brand of suffering. The trail boss led the way, followed by the point riders who guided the lead cattle. Behind them came the swing riders, then the flank riders, and finally, in the position reserved for the newest, youngest, or most unfortunate cowboys, the drag riders. These poor souls ate dust all day long, choking on the grit kicked up by thousands of hooves, while trying to keep the stragglers moving and prevent cattle from wandering off to die in some godforsaken gulch. The dust was legendary in its awfulness. It wasn't just dirt, it was a fine talcum-like powder mixed with dried manure that worked its way into every pore, every fold of clothing, every orifice of your body. Cowboys would tie bandanas around their faces, but it was like trying to stop a river with a handkerchief. By evening, men would be coughing up mud, their eyes red and streaming, their nostrils caked with filth. Some developed what they called the trail cough, a persistent hack that could last for months after a drive ended. Water was precious and often scarce. Rivers and streams were few and far between on the Great Plains, and when you did find water, it was frequently alkaline, contaminated, or claimed by hostile parties who didn't appreciate uninvited guests watering their cattle in the local swimming hole. Cowboys learned to ration water like liquid gold, often going days with barely enough to wet their whistles, let alone wash the accumulated grime from their bodies. Personal hygiene became a luxury that few could afford. The weather was an enemy that never slept. Spring drives might encounter late blizzards that could freeze cattle solid in their tracks. Summer brought heat that could kill a man. Temperatures soaring well over 100 degrees, with no shade for miles. Thunderstorms were particularly terrifying because they could spook the cattle into a stampede. Picture 2,000 panicked longhorns running blindly through the darkness while you're trying to turn them before they run off a cliff or trample each other to death. Lightning strikes were common, and more than one cowboy was found dead on the prairie, struck down while trying to control his horse during a storm. But perhaps the most dreaded weather phenomenon was the dreaded blue norther, sudden temperature drops of 40 or 50 degrees that could hit without warning. One moment you're sweltering under a blazing sun, the next you're fighting for survival as Arctic winds howl across the plains. Cowboys would go from heat exhaustion to hypothermia in a matter of hours, their bodies unable to cope with such dramatic changes. Sleep was a luxury that existed more in theory than practice. Even when the cattle were bedded down for the night, someone had to maintain watch. Cowboys worked in shifts, riding slowly around the herd, singing softly to keep the cattle calm. The songs weren't romantic ballads about love and freedom. They were monotonous, droning melodies designed to be as boring as possible, lullabies for livestock. Many nights, especially during thunderstorms or in hostile territory, no one slept at all. The famous cowboy bedroll was little more than a canvas tarp and a couple of blankets. There were no mattresses, no pillows, just the hard ground beneath your aching bones. Cowboys slept fully clothed, boots on, ready to leap up at the first sign of trouble. Comfort was a foreign concept. You learned to sleep through rain, wind, the lowing of cattle, and the howling of coyotes. If you were lucky, you might find a slight depression in the earth to shield you from the wind. If you were unlucky, you might wake up to find a rattlesnake had decided to share your warmth during the night. Food on the trail was an exercise in survival, not cuisine. The chuck wagon, that iconic symbol of the Old West, carried basic staples designed to keep men alive rather than happy. Beans were the foundation of every meal, cooked in massive iron pots and served with monotonous regularity. Hardtack, a tooth-breaking biscuit that could survive nuclear war, provided carbohydrates. Salt pork added fat and flavour when available. Coffee was considered essential, not for its taste but for the caffeine needed to function on little sleep. Fresh meat came from cattle that died along the trail, assuming you could get to the carcass before the buzzards and coyotes. Vegetables were almost non-existent, leading to scurvy and other nutritional deficiencies. Many cowboys suffered from chronic digestive problems, their systems rebelling against the relentless diet of beans and grease. Dysentery was common, adding another layer of misery to an already miserable existence. The cook held enormous power on a cattle drive, second only to the trail boss in authority. This wasn't because of culinary skill, but because he controlled the one thing that kept the outfit functioning: food. A good cook could boost morale and keep men working. A bad cook could cause mutiny. Most cooks were former cowboys who'd been injured or were too old for the physical demands of herding cattle. They were often grumpy, territorial, and protective of their domain around the chuck wagon. Smart cowboys learned never to argue with the cook, no matter how terrible the food might be. Medical care on the trail ranged from primitive to non-existent. There were no doctors riding along on cattle drives, no hospitals within hundreds of miles. Cowboys treated their own injuries with whatever they had on hand. Whiskey served as both anesthetic and antiseptic. Gunpowder mixed with lard became a crude salve for wounds. Broken bones were splintered with whatever wood could be found and wrapped with torn clothing. Many cowboys carried crude surgical instruments, not because they were trained in their use, but because sometimes desperate situations called for desperate measures. Accidents were frequent and often fatal. Horses would fall, crushing riders beneath their weight. Cattle would turn suddenly, goring men with their massive horns. River crossings claimed lives when cowboys were swept away by strong currents or dragged down by their heavy gear. Firearms accidents were common among men who lived with loaded weapons constantly at hand. Infection could turn a minor cut into a death sentence when you were days away from any kind of medical help. The psychological toll was perhaps even worse than the physical suffering. Months on the trail meant isolation from civilization, from family, from any human contact outside the small group of men sharing the same miseries. Many cowboys were illiterate and couldn't write letters home, even when the opportunity arose. They lived in a world of masculine stoicism where showing weakness or emotion was seen as failure. Depression was common but unacknowledged. Suicide rates among cowboys were significantly higher than among other occupations of the era. The famous cowboy independence was largely a myth born of necessity rather than choice. These men were employees, wage labourers working for large ranching operations or cattle companies. They had bosses, schedules, and quotas, just like any other worker. The difference was that their office was the open range, and their mistakes could result in death rather than just a reprimand from management. Wages were another cruel joke played on these men by circumstance and necessity. A typical cowboy earned between $25 and $40 per month, assuming he survived long enough to collect his pay. To put this in perspective, a skilled carpenter or blacksmith in town might earn twice that amount while sleeping in a real bed every night. The cowboy's salary had to cover not just his living expenses, but also his equipment. Horses, saddles, bridles, ropes, boots, guns, ammunition, and clothing all came out of his pocket. A good horse could cost a month's wages, and horses died regularly from exhaustion, injury, or disease. Many cowboys found themselves perpetually in debt to their employers, trapped in a cycle of advances against future wages that kept them bound to the ranch like medieval serfs. The company store charged inflated prices for basic necessities, and cowboys often discovered that their final pay barely covered what they owed for supplies. It was a system designed to keep labour cheap and desperate, ensuring a steady supply of men willing to endure almost any hardship for the promise of eventual payment. The social structure of a cattle outfit was rigid and unforgiving. At the top sat the trail boss, usually an experienced cattleman who answered directly to the ranch owner. Below him came the experienced hands, men who'd survived multiple drives and earned the grudging respect of their peers. Then came the regular cowboys, the backbone of the operation, followed by the horse wranglers responsible for the remuda, the herd of horses that accompanied every drive. At the bottom of this hierarchy were the newest hands, the boys and inexperienced men who caught the worst jobs and the most abuse. This wasn't a brotherhood of equals sharing adventures under the stars. It was a workplace with clear divisions of power, respect, and privilege. Older hands bullied newcomers mercilessly, seeing it as both entertainment and education. Practical jokes on the trail could be vicious, sometimes dangerous. A greenhorn might find his bedroll filled with cactus spines, his coffee spiked with jalapeno peppers, or his horse replaced with an unbroken bronco. The hazing was supposedly meant to toughen up new men, but it often drove them away before they could learn the skills needed to survive. Violence was a constant undercurrent in cowboy life, not the romanticized gunfights of legend, but the brutal reality of men living under extreme stress with few outlets for frustration. Fistfights were common, often over trivial matters that seemed important when you were exhausted, hungry, and hadn't seen a woman or a comfortable chair in months. Knives and guns were always present, and arguments could escalate quickly into bloodshed. Many cowboys carried scars from encounters with their own colleagues, wounds inflicted not by hostile Indians or dangerous outlaws, but by the men they worked alongside every day. The famous cowboy code of honor was more mythology than reality. While some men certainly lived by principles of loyalty and fairness, many others were opportunistic, cruel, or simply broken by the harsh realities of their existence. Theft was common, especially of personal items like tobacco, whiskey, or decent boots. Trust was a luxury that few could afford, when survival often depended on looking out for yourself first. Gambling was one of the few entertainments available on the trail, and it often led to more conflict than enjoyment. Card games around the campfire might seem romantic in hindsight, but they were frequently sources of arguments, accusations of cheating, and violence. Men who'd lost their wages to a lucky hand might turn desperate, leading to confrontations that could split an outfit apart when unity was essential for survival. The relationship between cowboys and their horses was complex and often misunderstood by popular culture. While some men certainly developed bonds with their mounts, horses were primarily tools, expensive and necessary equipment that required constant care and attention. A cowboy might ride 4 or 5 different horses during a single day, switching mounts to prevent exhaustion. These weren't pet relationships built on affection, but working partnerships based on mutual survival. Horses died frequently on the trail, victims of injury, disease, exhaustion, or simple bad luck. When a horse went lame or broke a leg, there was only one humane solution, and cowboys learned to pull the trigger without sentiment. Replacing a dead horse meant either catching and breaking a wild mustang, a dangerous and time-consuming process, or riding double with another cowboy until the next town where horses might be purchased. Either option created additional hardship for men already pushed to their limits. The famous cowboy horsemanship was born of necessity rather than natural talent. These men spent 12 to 16 hours a day in the saddle, developing skills through painful repetition and frequent accidents. Learning to ride well enough to do the job meant countless falls, injuries, and humiliating failures. Young cowboys often bore the scars of their education, broken bones that had healed crookedly, missing teeth from encounters with saddle horns, and permanent limps from horses that had fallen on them. Horsebreaking was a particularly brutal aspect of cowboy life that bore little resemblance to the skilled exhibitions seen in modern rodeos. Wild horses were often broken through exhaustion and fear rather than patient training. Cowboys would rope a mustang, tie it down, and saddle it while it was helpless. Then came the real test, staying mounted while the horse tried everything in its power to remove the unwanted rider. Men were thrown, trampled, and sometimes killed in the process of breaking horses that might only serve the outfit for a few months before wearing out or dying. The gear that defined a cowboy's identity was as much burden as blessing. A full rig of saddle, bridle, rope, and other equipment could weigh over 100 pounds. This had to be maintained constantly, cleaned and oiled to prevent cracking in the harsh climate. A saddle was often a cowboy's most valuable possession, custom-made to fit both horse and rider, but it was also a source of constant discomfort. 16 hours in any saddle, no matter how well made, created sores, chafing, and chronic pain that became part of daily existence. The iconic cowboy hat served practical purposes, but was hardly the stylish accessory depicted in movies. It protected against sun and rain, could be used to carry water or fan a fire, and helped keep dust out of eyes and ears. But it was also hot, uncomfortable when wet, and constantly at risk of being blown away by prairie winds. Many cowboys tied their hats to their heads with strings, creating an unglamorous but necessary modification to the romantic image. Boots were perhaps the most critical piece of equipment a cowboy owned, and good boots were expensive, hard to find, and wore out quickly under the constant abuse of trail life. Many cowboys made do with whatever footwear they could afford, often boots that didn't fit properly, creating blisters, ingrown toenails, and foot problems that could plague a man for life. The high heels that characterized cowboy boots weren't a fashion statement, but a practical necessity, designed to prevent feet from sliding through stirrups, which could result in being dragged to death by a panicked horse. Personal hygiene on the trail wasn't just uncomfortable, it was practically impossible. Water was too precious to waste on washing, and privacy was non-existent when travelling with a group of men across open country. Cowboys went weeks without bathing, their bodies layered with dirt, sweat, and the accumulated grime of the trail. Lice and fleas were constant companions, adding to the misery of men already pushed beyond endurance. Clothing became stiff with dirt and sweat, chafing against skin that never had a chance to heal. Undergarments, when they existed at all, were rarely changed or washed. The romantic image of the well-dressed cowboy was pure fantasy, replaced by the reality of men whose clothes were patched, stained, and often falling apart from constant wear and abuse. The isolation of trail life created psychological pressures that few men were prepared to handle. Months without female companionship, without the civilizing influence of towns and communities, could drive men to desperation or madness. Some cowboys talked to their horses, their only consistent companions in a world of constant hardship. Others withdrew into themselves, becoming silent and unreachable, lost in their own private struggles, with demons that had no name in an era when mental health was neither understood nor discussed. The famous cattle towns that marked the end of long drives were supposed to be the cowboys' reward, places where months of suffering would be forgotten in a blur of whiskey, women, and wild times. The reality was considerably more sobering. Towns like Abilene, Dodge City, and Cheyenne existed primarily to separate cowboys from whatever money they had managed to earn, and they did so with ruthless efficiency. After months on the trail, arriving in a cattle town was like stepping into an alien world. The noise, the crowds, the buildings rising more than one story into the sky, all of it overwhelmed men who had grown accustomed to endless silence and empty horizons. Cowboys stumbled off their horses like sailors finding land after a long voyage, their legs unsteady, their eyes struggling to adjust to the chaos of civilization. The first stop was usually a bathhouse, where for 50 cents a cowboy could soak in lukewarm water that had already been used by a dozen other trail-weary men. The luxury of hot water and soap was almost overwhelming after months of accumulated filth, but even this simple pleasure came with risks. Many cowboys emerged from their baths with skin infections, rashes, or worse ailments picked up from contaminated water that served as a breeding ground for every disease that passed through town. Next came new clothes, or at least clean ones. Cowboys would spend their hard-earned wages on shirts, pants, and boots that might last them through the next drive, assuming they survived long enough to need them. Prices in cattle towns were inflated beyond reason, taking advantage of men who had no choice but to pay whatever was asked. A shirt that might cost $2 in St. Louis could easily run $5 or $6 in Dodge City, and cowboys paid it gladly because the alternative was wearing clothes that could practically stand up by themselves. The saloons that lined the main streets of every cattle town were designed to extract maximum profit from cowboys in minimum time. Whiskey was watered down, beer was warm and often contaminated, and the gambling games were rigged in favour of the house. Professional gamblers descended on cattle towns like vultures, targeting cowboys who had more money than sense and far less experience with cards than they imagined. A cowboy might enter a saloon with a month's wages and leave an hour later with nothing but a hangover and empty pockets. Prostitution was a thriving industry in cattle towns, offering cowboys their first contact with women in months. But this intimacy came at a steep price, both financial and physical. Diseases spread rapidly through the red light districts, and many cowboys contracted ailments that would plague them for the rest of their shortened lives. Syphilis and gonorrhea were common occupational hazards of cowboy life, adding another layer of suffering to men already broken by the trail. Violence in cattle towns was swift, brutal, and often meaningless. Cowboys, their judgment impaired by alcohol and their nerves frayed by months of stress, would fight over perceived slights, card games, or women who cared nothing for them beyond their ability to pay. Knives flashed in dim saloons, guns barked in dusty streets, and men died for reasons they couldn't remember by morning. The famous gunfighters of legend were often nothing more than hired killers employed by business interests to maintain a semblance of order that served commerce rather than justice. Local law enforcement viewed cowboys with a mixture of contempt and wariness. These men brought money into town, which was good for business, but they also brought violence, disease, and chaos. Town marshals like Wild Bill Hickok and Wyatt Earp became famous not for upholding justice, but for their ability to intimidate or eliminate cowboys who threatened the delicate balance between profit and order. Cowboys were tolerated as long as they spent their money quickly and left before wearing out their welcome. The economic system of cattle towns was designed to ensure that cowboys left with as little money as possible. Everything was overpriced, from meals to lodging to entertainment. A bed in a flophouse might cost $1 a night, more than a cowboy typically earned in a day, and the accommodations were often worse than sleeping on the open range. Bed bugs, lice, and theft were constant concerns in establishments that cared more about quick turnover than customer satisfaction. Medical care in cattle towns was marginally better than on the trail, but not by much. Doctors, when they could be found, were often quacks with questionable credentials and a fondness for alcohol that rivaled their patients. Surgery was performed without anesthesia, amputations were common solutions to treatable problems, and infection killed more men than bullets ever did. Cowboys who sought medical attention often died from the cure rather than the disease. The social hierarchy that existed on the trail continued in cattle towns, but with new layers of complexity. Local businessmen looked down on cowboys as necessary but undesirable elements, tolerated for their money but despised for their rough manners and violent tendencies. Cowboys, in turn, resented the townspeople, who seemed to live comfortable lives while profiting from cowboy suffering. This mutual antagonism created an atmosphere of tension that could explode into violence at any moment. Women in cattle towns occupied a precarious position in this masculine world. Respectable women avoided cowboys entirely, crossing streets to escape their attention and viewing them as dangerous animals barely contained by civilization. The women who did interact with cowboys, prostitutes, saloon girls, and dance hall performers were themselves victims of a system that offered them few alternatives to survive in a harsh frontier economy. Even the famous cowboy entertainment was more sordid than romantic. Rodeos began not as organized sporting events, but as informal competitions between drunk cowboys trying to prove their worth to each other and to women who were paid to watch. Men risked life and limb riding broncos and bulls not for prize money, which rarely existed, but for bragging rights that would be forgotten by morning. Injuries were common, medical care was non-existent, and more than one cowboy died trying to impress an audience that would step over his body to watch the next act. The reality of winter for most cowboys was a harsh awakening to the seasonal nature of their employment. Cattle drives typically ran from spring through fall, leaving cowboys unemployed during the coldest months when work was scarce and survival became a daily struggle. Many cowboys spent their winters in line camps, remote cabins scattered across ranch property where they maintained equipment and watched over cattle in exchange for basic shelter and food. These line camps were often little more than one-room shacks, poorly insulated and barely adequate to keep out the brutal prairie winters. Cowboys would spend months in near isolation, their only companions the occasional visitor bringing supplies or news from the outside world. The psychological toll of this solitude was enormous, driving some men to madness and others to suicide. Those who survived the winter often emerged changed, marked by an experience that had stripped away whatever remained of their humanity. The work during winter months was different, but no less demanding than trail driving. Cowboys had to break ice on water sources, dig cattle out of snowdrifts, and battle blizzards that could last for days. Frostbite was common, taking fingers, toes, and sometimes entire limbs from men who couldn't afford proper winter gear. The cold was so intense that metal tools would stick to bare skin, and horses would freeze to death if left standing too long without movement. Food during winter months was even more monotonous than trail rations, if such a thing was possible. Canned goods, dried meat, and whatever game could be shot provided the basic calories needed for survival. But fresh vegetables and fruits were impossible luxuries. Scurvy returned with a vengeance during long winters, leaving cowboys with bleeding gums, loose teeth, and a host of other ailments that marked them as men living on the edge of starvation. The isolation of winter camps also meant that medical emergencies became death sentences. A broken leg, a severe cut, or even a bad case of pneumonia could kill a man who might have survived with proper care. Cowboys learned to be their own doctors, setting bones with whatever materials were available, stitching wounds with horsehair, and treating infections with whatever folk remedies they could remember. Many didn't survive their own attempts at self-treatment. Spring brought the promise of new work but also new hardships as cowboys emerged from winter camps, weakened by months of poor food, isolation, and brutal weather. The cycle would begin again, another season of suffering disguised as adventure, another chance to risk life and limb for wages that barely covered the cost of staying alive. Those who had survived one winter might not survive the next, and everyone knew it. The equipment that had served through one season was often worn out and needed replacement, but cowboys emerging from winter camps rarely had money for new gear. They patched what could be patched, improvised what could be improvised, and made do with equipment that was dangerous to use but impossible to replace. Saddles held together with wire and hope, boots with holes that let in water and cold, ropes that might snap at the crucial moment when a cowboy's life depended on their strength. The horses, too, emerged from winter in poor condition, thin and weak from months of inadequate feed and harsh weather. These animals that were essential to cowboy survival were often in no better shape than their riders, creating a partnership of desperation, where both man and beast struggled simply to function well enough to earn their keep. The romantic image of the cowboy and his trusty steed was replaced by the reality of two malnourished creatures trying to survive another day in a world that seemed designed to kill them. The social dynamics of cowboy crews changed with each season as men died, quit, or simply disappeared into the vastness of the frontier. New faces appeared each spring, young men drawn by the same myths and legends that had lured their predecessors, only to discover the same harsh realities that had broken so many before them. The cycle of hope and disillusionment continued, fed by a culture that celebrated cowboy life while ignoring its brutal cost in human suffering. Veterans of multiple seasons could be identified by their scars, their premature aging, and their cynical acceptance of hardships that would break lesser men. These survivors had learned to expect nothing and accept everything, to find small pleasures in moments of relative comfort, and to endure pain that would send modern men screaming to emergency rooms. They were hard men made harder by circumstances that allowed no weakness, no complaint, no surrender, except in death. The famous cowboy loyalty was often nothing more than shared misery. Men bound together not by choice, but by the knowledge that their survival depended on cooperation with others who were equally desperate. Friendships forged on the trail were partnerships of necessity rather than affection, alliances that lasted only as long as they served mutual survival. When the drives ended and the men scattered to winter camps or other employment, these bonds often dissolved as quickly as they had formed. The cowboys' relationship with death was intimate and constant. Men died from accidents, disease, violence, and simple exhaustion with such regularity that their passing barely registered beyond the immediate inconvenience of their absence. Graves dotted the cattle trails, marked with crude wooden crosses or piles of stones that would be scattered by wind and weather within a few seasons. Most cowboys died anonymously, their bodies left where they fell, their stories untold and quickly forgotten by companions who had their own survival to worry about. The concept of cowboy retirement was a cruel joke played by time and circumstance on men whose bodies were breaking down before they reached middle age. There was no pension plan for cowboys, no comfortable rocking chair waiting on a front porch somewhere. Most cowboys were physically destroyed by their 30s, their backs permanently bent from years in the saddle, their joints swollen and arthritic from countless nights sleeping on frozen ground. Hands that had once been steady enough to rope a running steer now shook from nerve damage and old injuries that had never healed properly. Those lucky enough to survive into their 40s found themselves unemployable in a profession that demanded physical strength and endurance they no longer possessed. Ranch owners had no use for broken-down cowboys when there was always a supply of young men willing to take their places for the same miserable wages. The veterans of the cattle trails became drifters, beggars, or inhabitants of poorhouses in frontier towns that had once celebrated their contributions to the economy. Some attempted to transition into other work, but their skills were limited and their bodies were worn out. A cowboy who could handle 1,000 head of cattle might be completely helpless when faced with operating a store, learning a trade, or adapting to the rhythms of settled life. Many had never learned to read or write, their education consisting entirely of hard-won knowledge about horses, cattle, and survival that had little application in an increasingly civilized world. The psychological damage was often worse. Men than the physical deteriorator who had spent their prime years in constant motion, under open skies, felt themselves trapped in towns like prisons. The walls closed in on cowboys who had grown accustomed to horizons that stretched to infinity. Depression, alcoholism, and suicide claimed many who had survived bullets, stampedes, and blizzards, only to be defeated by the simple challenge of learning to live indoors. Those who managed to save any money during their working years often lost it to predatory businesses, crooked investments, or simply the inflated cost of living in towns where everything was priced to separate fools from their cash. The nest egg that a cowboy imagined would see him through his golden years might last 6 months in a boarding house before he found himself back on the street, too old to work and too proud to beg. The transformation of the cattle industry itself conspired against aging cowboys who found their skills obsolete almost overnight. The open range that had defined their world was being divided by barbed wire, turning the vast grasslands into a patchwork of private property where trespassing could get a man shot. Railroad expansion meant that cattle no longer needed to be driven hundreds of miles to market. Shorter drives required fewer men, and those men could be younger, cheaper, more easily replaced. Refrigerated railroad cars eliminated the need for many of the traditional cattle towns that had served as endpoints for the great drives. Abilene, Dodge City, and other legendary destinations became quiet farming communities almost overnight. Their saloons boarded up, their brothels shuttered, their reason for existence evaporated like morning dew on the prairie. Cowboys who had spent years learning the routes to these towns found their knowledge worthless, their expertise in navigating trails that no longer mattered. The invention of barbed wire in the 1870s marked the beginning of the end for the traditional cowboy way of life. This simple innovation allowed ranchers to fence vast areas of land, controlling cattle movement without the need for constant human supervision. Herds that had once required dozens of cowboys to manage could now be contained by wire and occasional riders checking the fences. The romantic image of cowboys driving cattle across open range was replaced by the mundane reality of fence maintenance and repair. Technological advances in other areas also reduced the demand for cowboy labour. Better breeding techniques produced cattle that were easier to handle, reducing the need for skilled horsemen who could manage wild longhorns. Improved transportation infrastructure meant that cattle could be moved by rail rather than on foot, eliminating the need for the massive trail drives that had employed thousands of cowboys. The very progress that was sizing the West was simultaneously destroying the economic foundation that had supported cowboy culture. The influx of European immigrants into the American West brought competition for jobs that cowboys had once considered their exclusive domain. German, Irish and Scandinavian farmers were willing to work for lower wages and were often more reliable employees than cowboys who might disappear at any moment in search of better opportunities or simply because the wandering urge had overtaken them. Ranch owners discovered that immigrant workers were often more skilled in animal husbandry, more disciplined in their work habits, and less likely to cause trouble in town during their off hours. The romanticization of cowboy life that began even during the height of the cattle drives created a mythology that bore little resemblance to reality, but proved more enduring than the truth. Dime novels, Wild West shows, and eventually motion pictures created an image of cowboys as heroic figures living lives of adventure and freedom. This fantasy version of cowboy life attracted tourists and investors to the West, but it also created unrealistic expectations among young men who arrived expecting to find the glamorous life described in popular culture. Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show, which toured the United States and Europe beginning in the 1880s, presented a sanitized version of frontier life that emphasized excitement and adventure, while carefully omitting the grinding poverty, disease, and desperation that characterized actual cowboy existence. Audiences thrilled to demonstrations of riding and shooting skills, while remaining blissfully ignorant of the malnutrition, alcoholism, and premature death that were the real hallmarks of cowboy life. The show business cowboys who performed in these entertainments were often more skilled riders and ropers than working cowboys, but they represented a fundamental shift in how cowboy culture was perceived and packaged for public consumption. Real cowboys became caricatures of themselves, expected to live up to an image created by people who had never spent a night sleeping on the ground or eating beans cooked over a buffalo chip fire. Even the famous cowboy clothing became more costume than practical work gear, as manufacturers began producing elaborate versions of cowboy attire for city dwellers who wanted to play dress-up. The simple, functional clothing that real cowboys wore was replaced by ornate boots, fancy hats, and decorated leather goods that would have been laughably impractical for actual ranch work, but looked impressive on stage or in photographs. The cattle barons, who employed cowboys, were themselves often absentee owners, wealthy Eastern investors who saw ranching as a romantic adventure rather than a serious business. These men would arrive for brief hunting expeditions or social gatherings, expecting to be entertained by colourful cowboy characters who bore little resemblance to the exhausted, dirty, often desperate men who actually did the work. The disconnect between fantasy and reality created resentment among working cowboys who found themselves expected to perform as entertainers as well as labourers. The economic reality of the cattle industry was far removed from the romantic image of independent ranchers building empires on the open range. Most successful ranching operations were corporate enterprises backed by significant capital investment, often from foreign sources. Scottish and English investors poured millions of dollars into American cattle ranches during the boom years of the 1870s and 1880s, treating the enterprise as a speculative venture rather than a way of life. These corporate ranches operated on industrial principles, treating cowboys as interchangeable units of labour rather than skilled craftsmen. Efficiency and cost control took precedence over worker welfare, leading to working conditions that were harsh even by the standards of an era not known for its concern with employee rights. Cowboys found themselves subject to increasingly rigid rules and supervision, their traditional independence eroded by managers who viewed them with suspicion and contempt. The boom and bust cycles that characterized the cattle industry created economic instability that made cowboy employment even more precarious than it had been during the early days of the open range. Overproduction led to falling beef prices, which in turn led to wage cuts and layoffs that left thousands of cowboys unemployed and stranded far from home. The winter of 1886 to 1887, known as the Great Die-Up, killed millions of cattle and bankrupted many ranching operations, leaving cowboys without work and without prospects in a collapsing industry. Competition from other forms of protein production also threatened the cattle industry's dominance. Pork production was becoming more efficient and profitable, while chicken farming was emerging as a viable alternative to beef. The expansion of agriculture into former grazing lands reduced the amount of range available for cattle, forcing ranchers to purchase or lease land at prices that made traditional cattle operations unprofitable. The social isolation that had always characterized cowboy life became more pronounced as the frontier became increasingly settled. Towns that had once welcomed cowboys as sources of revenue began to view them as undesirable elements, potential troublemakers who threatened the respectable image that growing communities wanted to project. Ordinances banning firearms within city limits, restrictions on public drinking, and other civilizing influences made cowboys feel increasingly unwelcome in the very towns their labour had helped to build. The demographic changes in the West also worked against cowboy culture. The arrival of families, the establishment of schools and churches, and the growth of stable communities created social pressures that were incompatible with the transient, predominantly male culture of the cattle trails. Cowboys found themselves viewed as anachronisms, reminders of a wilder past that respectable citizens preferred to forget or romanticize rather than accommodate. Educational opportunities that might have helped cowboys transition to other occupations were virtually non-existent on the frontier. Most cowboys had received little formal schooling, and their lifestyle made it impossible to pursue education, even if it had been available. The skills they possessed were highly specialized and increasingly obsolete, leaving them ill-equipped to adapt to economic changes that were transforming the entire region. The legal system that emerged in the West was often hostile to cowboy interests and culture. Laws designed to protect property rights and maintain social order frequently criminalized behaviors that had been necessary for survival on the open range. Carrying weapons, settling disputes through violence, and the informal justice that had characterized frontier life became illegal activities that could result in imprisonment or worse. Even the weather seemed to turn against the cowboy way of life during the 1880s. A series of harsh winters followed by severe droughts created conditions that decimated cattle herds and bankrupted ranching operations. The natural cycles that cowboys had learned to work with became increasingly unpredictable, making their traditional knowledge less valuable and their survival skills inadequate for changing environmental conditions. The expansion of agricultural settlements into former grazing lands created conflicts between cowboys and farmers that often turned violent. Farmers viewed cowboys as representatives of an anarchic system that threatened their property and safety, while cowboys saw farmers as destroyers of the open range that had been their livelihood. These conflicts were usually resolved in favour of the farmers, who had the law, public opinion, and economic development on their side. The transformation of the American economy during the late 19th century created opportunities in manufacturing, mining, and other industries that offered alternatives to agricultural work, but these opportunities were generally unavailable to cowboys whose skills and education were inadequate for industrial employment. The jobs that were available to former cowboys were typically in the lowest paying, most dangerous sectors of the economy, offering little improvement over the hardships they had already endured. The myth of cowboy individualism obscured the reality that these men had always been dependent on complex economic and social systems that were beyond their control. The cattle industry that employed them was subject to market forces, weather patterns, technological changes, and political decisions made in distant cities by people who had never seen a cow outside of a picture book. Cowboys were not independent entrepreneurs, but wage labourers whose fate was determined by forces they neither understood nor influenced. The gradual mechanisation of ranch work eliminated many of the jobs that had traditionally employed cowboys. Steam-powered equipment for hay cutting and hauling reduced the need for human labour, while improved transportation systems made it possible to manage larger operations with fewer workers. The skills that had made cowboys valuable employees became less important as ranching became more mechanised and scientific. The consolidation of the cattle industry into fewer, larger operations also reduced employment opportunities for cowboys. Small ranches that might have employed a dozen cowboys were absorbed by corporate enterprises that could achieve the same results with half as many workers. The personal relationships that had sometimes existed between cowboys and ranch owners were replaced by impersonal employment practices that treated workers as expendable resources. The cultural changes that accompanied the closing of the frontier created an environment in which cowboy values and behaviours were increasingly seen as primitive and antisocial. The emphasis on education, law and order, and social conformity that characterized the emerging American society was fundamentally incompatible with the independence, violence, and transient lifestyle that had defined cowboy culture. The health problems that plagued aging cowboys were often the direct result of their working conditions, but medical understanding of occupational health hazards was virtually non-existent during the late 19th century. Cowboys suffered from respiratory diseases caused by constant exposure to dust, joint problems from years of riding and heavy labour, and a host of other ailments that were accepted as inevitable consequences of their chosen profession rather than preventable occupational hazards. The lack of social safety nets in frontier society meant that disabled or elderly cowboys had few options beyond charity or crime. There were no disability security, no benefits, no social programs to help workers transition to new occupations. Cowboys who could no longer work faced destitution and often chose death over the humiliation of dependence on charity from communities that had little sympathy for their plight. The seasonal nature of cowboy employment made it difficult for these men to establish stable relationships or build lasting connections to communities. The constant movement required by their work prevented cowboys from putting down roots, accumulating property, or developing the social ties that might have provided support during times of hardship. They lived as perpetual outsiders, welcome nowhere and belonging to no place. The mythology surrounding cowboys often depicted them as men who lived for excitement and adventure. But the reality was that most cowboys spent their working lives in a state of chronic boredom punctuated by moments of terror. The long hours in the saddle, moving slowly across endless plains with nothing but the sound of hooves and the occasional lowing of cattle, created a mind-numbing monotony that drove many men to distraction. There were no podcasts to listen to, no books to read while riding, no smartphones to scroll through during the endless hours of tedium. Cowboys developed various strategies to cope with the crushing boredom of their daily existence. Some talked to their horses, carrying on long conversations with animals that at least provided the illusion of companionship. Others sang, not the romantic ballads of Hollywood imagination, but repetitive, droning songs designed more to stay awake than to entertain. Many simply retreated into their own minds, developing elaborate fantasies about the lives they might have lived if circumstances had been different. The psychological impact of this isolation and monotony was profound. Men who had once been social creatures found themselves becoming increasingly withdrawn and antisocial. The ability to carry on normal conversations atrophied from lack of practice, leaving cowboys tongue-tied and awkward when they finally encountered other human beings. Many developed nervous habits, compulsive behaviours, and speech patterns that marked them as men who had spent too much time alone with their thoughts. The famous campfire gatherings that feature so prominently in cowboy mythology were often exercises in collective depression rather than camaraderie. Exhausted men would sit around smoky fires, too tired to talk, too uncomfortable to sleep properly, staring into flames while contemplating the futility of their existence. Conversation, when it occurred at all, was usually complaints about the food, the weather, the cattle, or the boss. Philosophical discussions about life, love, and the meaning of existence were rare luxuries that most cowboys couldn't afford. Even the supposed freedom of the open range was largely illusory. Cowboys were bound by strict schedules, predetermined routes, and the constant demands of the cattle they were driving. Every decision was made by someone else. Every mile was dictated by necessity rather than choice. The vast expanse of the American West, rather than offering unlimited possibilities, became a prison without walls, a place where men could see for miles in every direction, but were never free to choose their own destination. The economic realities of cowboy life created a cycle of dependency that trapped men in a system they couldn't escape. Low wages meant that cowboys could never accumulate enough money to pursue other opportunities, while the specialized nature of their skills made it difficult to find alternative employment. They were caught between a job that was destroying their bodies and minds and an economic system that offered no viable alternatives for men with their limited education and experience. The clothing and equipment that defined cowboy identity were sources of constant discomfort rather than pride. Heavy leather chaps, designed to protect legs from thorns and rough vegetation, became furnaces in the summer heat and ice-cold torture devices in winter. Spurs, those iconic symbols of cowboy culture, were practical tools that often caused more injury to the wearer than benefit. Digging into legs during long rides and catching on everything from stirrups to tent flaps. The famous cowboy diet was not just monotonous, but actively harmful to health. The lack of fresh vegetables and fruits led to widespread nutritional deficiencies that manifested in tooth loss, poor wound healing, and chronic fatigue. Scurvy was common among cowboys, causing bleeding gums, loose teeth, and painful joints. The high salt content of preserved meats led to kidney problems and high blood pressure, while the constant consumption of coffee and alcohol created dependencies that further compromised health. Dental care on the frontier was virtually non-existent, leading to widespread tooth decay and gum disease among cowboys who lived on a diet of hard bread, tough meat, and sugary coffee. Many cowboys lost most of their teeth by their 30s, making eating difficult and painful while adding to their already considerable discomfort. The lucky ones might encounter a travelling dentist with a pair of pliers and a bottle of whiskey, but most simply endured the pain until infected teeth either fell out or killed them. The romantic notion of cowboys as skilled marksmen was largely a product of dime novel fantasy rather than frontier reality. Most cowboys were poor shots with their revolvers, having little ammunition to spare for target practice, and even less inclination to waste money on something that wasn't directly related to their survival. When violence did occur, it was usually messy, inaccurate, and concluded quickly by whoever got lucky rather than whoever was more skilled. The firearms that cowboys carried were often cheap, unreliable weapons that were more likely to misfire than to hit their intended target. Ammunition was expensive and had to be conserved for emergencies, meaning that most cowboys went months without firing their weapons. When they did need to use them, the results were often disappointing. with bullets going wide of their marks and weapons jamming at critical moments. The legendary quick-draw duels of cowboy folklore were almost entirely fictional. Real violence on the frontier was usually ambushes, drunken brawls, or accidents rather than formal confrontations between skilled gunfighters. When cowboys did kill each other, it was typically over trivial matters like card games, women, or perceived insults. And the killing was usually done with knives, clubs, or rifles rather than the iconic six-shooters of popular imagination. The justice system in frontier towns was often as arbitrary and corrupt as the violence it was supposed to prevent. Local sheriffs and marshals were frequently former criminals themselves, chosen for their willingness to use violence rather than their commitment to law and order. Courts, when they existed at all, were informal affairs where verdicts were often predetermined by local politics and economic interests rather than evidence or testimony. Cowboys who found themselves on the wrong side of frontier justice could expect little mercy from legal systems designed to protect property and maintain order rather than ensure fairness. A cowboy accused of cattle rustling might be hanged without trial, while a wealthy rancher who murdered a cowboy might escape punishment entirely if he had sufficient political connections. The law was a tool of the powerful rather than a protection for the weak. The medical treatment available to injured or sick cowboys was often worse than no doctors were frequently treatment at all. Frontier quacks, drunks, or simply desperate men who had taken up medicine because they couldn't succeed at anything else. Surgery was performed without anesthesia, using instruments that were rarely clean and techniques that were often experimental. More cowboys probably died from medical treatment than were saved by it. Patent medicines, heavily advertised in frontier newspapers, were usually nothing more than alcohol mixed with various plant extracts and marketed as cures for everything from tuberculosis to broken bones. Cowboys desperate for relief from chronic pain and illness would spend their scarce wages on these concoctions, which provided temporary numbing at best and often made their conditions worse through poisoning or addiction. The dental work available on the frontier was limited to extraction, usually performed by blacksmiths or barbers using pliers and brute force. There was no anesthesia beyond whiskey, no antiseptic procedures, and no follow-up care. Many cowboys died from infections that began as simple tooth extractions, while others lived with chronic pain from botched dental work that left fragments of broken teeth embedded in their jaws. The social stigma attached to cowboy life extended far beyond the frontier towns, where they spent their wages. Eastern newspapers regularly published articles describing cowboys as dangerous savages, little better than the Indians they sometimes fought. This negative publicity made it difficult for former cowboys to find respectable employment when they tried to leave the cattle industry, as potential employers viewed them with suspicion and fear. And the popular literature of the era reinforced these negative stereotypes while simultaneously romanticizing cowboy life in ways that bore no resemblance to reality. Dime novels portrayed cowboys as either noble heroes or dangerous villains, but never as the desperate, poorly paid labourers they actually were. This disconnect between reality and popular perception created unrealistic expectations among young men who travelled west seeking adventure and found only hardship. The educational opportunities that might have helped cowboys develop skills for other occupations were virtually non-existent on the frontier. Schools were rare, libraries were non-existent, and literacy rates among cowboys were significantly lower than among the general population. The constant movement required by their work made it impossible to pursue education even when it was available, trapping cowboys in a cycle of ignorance and economic dependency. The family life that most men took for granted was largely impossible for cowboys whose work required constant travel and whose wages were insufficient to support dependents. Many cowboys never married, not by choice but because no respectable woman would consider marrying a man with such uncertain prospects and dangerous lifestyle. Those who did marry often found that their relationships couldn't survive the long separations and economic hardship that characterized cowboy life. The children of cowboys, when they existed, often grew up in poverty, raised by mothers who struggled to survive on irregular and insufficient income sent home by absent fathers. These children frequently entered the workforce at young ages, perpetuating the cycle of poverty and limited opportunities that had trapped their parents. Education was a luxury that cowboy families couldn't afford, ensuring that the next generation would face the same limited prospects as their fathers. The housing available to cowboys in frontier towns was typically substandard and overpriced, designed to extract maximum profit from men who had few alternatives. Bunkhouses were often little more than wooden sheds with no insulation, inadequate heating, and minimal furniture. Privacy was non-existent, sanitation was primitive, and the risk of fire was constant in structures built quickly and cheaply from dry lumber. The boarding houses that catered to cowboys were notorious for their poor conditions and dishonest practices. Beds were often shared between multiple occupants, meals were frequently spoiled or contaminated, and theft was common among residents who had little respect for each other's property. Many cowboys preferred sleeping outdoors to paying for accommodations that were worse than what they experienced on the trail. The business practices in frontier towns were designed to separate cowboys from their money as quickly and completely as possible. Merchants sold inferior goods at inflated prices, knowing that cowboys had little choice but to pay whatever was asked. Credit was extended at usurious rates, trapping cowboys in debt cycles that could last for years. Gambling was rigged, prostitutes carried diseases, and alcohol was watered down or adulterated with dangerous chemicals. The entertainment industry that grew up around cowboy culture was similarly exploitative. Wild West shows employed real cowboys as performers, but paid them poorly while making fortunes from audiences fascinated by romanticized versions of frontier life. These shows created a distorted image of cowboy culture that emphasized excitement and adventure while ignoring the poverty, disease, and desperation that characterized the real experience. The seasonal nature of cowboy work created periods of unemployment that were often more difficult to survive than the working seasons themselves. Cowboys who had jobs during the spring and summer cattle drives found themselves without income during the fall and winter months, when there was little demand for their services. Many spent their off-season wages just trying to survive until work became available again, leaving them no opportunity to save money or invest in their future. The competition for jobs during the peak season was fierce, as unemployed cowboys from across the region competed for positions on cattle drives. This competition drove wages down and working conditions down, as desperate men were willing to accept almost any terms rather than face another winter without income. Ranch owners took advantage of this desperation, knowing that there were always more cowboys than jobs available. The technological changes that were transforming American society during the late 19th century largely bypassed the frontier regions where cowboys worked. While cities in the East were getting electric lights, telephones, and other modern conveniences, cowboys continued to live and work much as their predecessors had decades earlier. This technological gap made it even more difficult for cowboys to transition to other occupations when their services were no longer needed. The transportation revolution that brought railroads to the West ultimately destroyed the economic foundation of cowboy culture by eliminating the need for long-distance cattle drives. As railroad networks expanded, cattle could be shipped directly from ranches to markets without the expensive and time-consuming process of driving herds across hundreds of miles of open range. This efficiency was good for ranchers and consumers, but devastating for the thousands of cowboys whose livelihoods depended on the cattle drive system. The barbed wire that began appearing across the West during the 1870s represented more than just a new form of fencing. It was a symbol of the end of the open range and the cowboy way of life that had depended on it. As more and more land was fenced off for private use, the routes that cattle drives had followed for decades became impassable, forcing changes in the industry that eliminated many cowboy jobs. The environmental changes that accompanied settlement and development in the West also worked against traditional cowboy operations. Overgrazing destroyed the grasslands that had supported large cattle herds, while farming consumed water resources that had been essential for cattle drives. The ecological balance that had made the open range system possible was disrupted by human activity, making it impossible to continue the traditional practices that had employed thousands of cowboys. The cultural shifts that accompanied the closing of the frontier created an atmosphere in which cowboy values and behaviours were increasingly viewed as antisocial and primitive. The violence that had been necessary for survival on the open range was no longer acceptable in settled communities, while the independence and transience that had characterized cowboy life was incompatible with the stability and conformity that growing towns demanded. The economic depression that struck the cattle industry during the 1880s was particularly devastating for cowboys, who found themselves competing for fewer jobs at lower wages while facing increased living costs in rapidly growing frontier towns. Many cowboys who had managed to survive the physical hardships of their profession were finally defeated by economic forces beyond their control. Forced into poverty and unemployment by market conditions they neither understood nor influenced. The social isolation that had always been part of cowboy life became more pronounced as the frontier became settled and cowboys found themselves increasingly out of place in communities that were becoming more civilized and respectable. The skills that had made them valuable on the open range were less useful in settled society, while their rough manners and violent habits made them unwelcome in respectable company. The aging process was particularly cruel to cowboys whose bodies had been broken down by years of hard physical labor in harsh conditions. Unlike other occupations where experience and skill could compensate for physical decline, cowboy work required strength, endurance, and reflexes that inevitably deteriorated with age. Many cowboys found themselves unemployable by their 40s, too old to do the work but too young to die, facing decades of poverty and disability. The pension systems that were beginning to develop in other industries during the late 19th century were unknown in the cattle business, where cowboys were viewed as temporary employees rather than long-term investments worthy of retirement benefits. Cowboys who had devoted their lives to the industry found themselves abandoned when they could no longer work, with no financial security and no prospects for support in their old age. The healthcare system that was emerging in American cities during this period was largely unavailable to cowboys working in remote frontier regions. The chronic health problems that resulted from cowboy work, respiratory diseases from dust exposure, joint problems from years in the saddle, injuries from accidents with cattle and horses, received no treatment until they became so severe that work was impossible. By that time, medical intervention was often too late to be effective. The psychological trauma that resulted from the violence, isolation, and constant danger of cowboy life was neither recognised nor treated in an era that had no understanding of mental health issues. Cowboys who suffered from what would now be recognised as depression, anxiety, or post-traumatic stress disorder were simply viewed as weak or cowardly, adding shame and social rejection to their already considerable burdens. The family relationships that might have provided emotional support and stability were often damaged or destroyed by the demands of cowboy life. Long absences, dangerous work, and uncertain income made it difficult to maintain close relationships with parents, siblings, and other relatives. Many cowboys became estranged from their families, cut off from the support systems that might have helped them cope with the hardships of their chosen profession. The romantic partnerships that cowboys did manage to form were often doomed by the practical realities of frontier life. Women in frontier towns fell into distinct categories, none of which offered much hope. for lasting happiness. There were the respectable women, wives and daughters of merchants and professionals, who viewed cowboys as dangerous and undesirable. These women crossed streets to avoid cowboys, whispered warnings to their children about staying away from such rough men, and made it clear that no decent woman would associate with someone so far beneath their social station. Then there were the working women, saloon girls and prostitutes who interacted with cowboys professionally, but rarely formed genuine emotional connections. These relationships were transactional by nature, brief encounters that provided temporary companionship but little real intimacy. Many of these women were themselves victims of circumstance, trapped in frontier towns by poverty, addiction, or simply lack of alternatives. They understood that cowboys were temporary customers, not potential husbands or long-term partners. The few cowboys who did manage to marry often found that their wives couldn't cope with the uncertainty and hardship of frontier life. Women who had grown up in settled communities struggled with the isolation of ranch life, the constant worry about their husband's safety, and the grinding poverty that characterized most cowboy families. Many marriages ended in separation or abandonment, with wives returning to their families back east or simply disappearing one day while their husbands were away on cattle drives. The children who resulted from these brief unions often grew up without fathers, raised by mothers who struggled to survive on whatever irregular support they received. These children learned early that life was harsh and uncertain, that promises were easily broken, and that survival required self-reliance rather than dependence on others. Many entered the workforce while still children, contributing whatever they could earn to family survival, rather than attending school or enjoying anything resembling a normal childhood. The mail system that might have helped cowboys maintain connections with distant family and friends was unreliable at best in frontier regions. Letters took weeks or months to reach their destinations, assuming they arrived at all. Many cowboys were functionally illiterate anyway, unable to write letters even when the opportunity arose. The isolation they experienced wasn't just physical, but emotional and psychological, cutting them off from the human connections that make life bearable. The religious institutions that provided comfort and community for many Americans during this period were largely absent from cowboy life. Circuit preachers occasionally visited frontier towns, but their services were brief and infrequent. The constant movement required by cowboy work made it impossible to participate in regular religious activities or develop relationships with clergy who might have provided spiritual guidance and emotional support. The absence of religious structure left many cowboys adrift spiritually, with no framework for understanding their suffering or finding meaning in their hardships. Some developed their own personal philosophies based on stoic acceptance of fate, while others turned to alcohol or violence as ways of coping with existential despair. The promise of heavenly reward that sustained many Americans through earthly trials was cold comfort to men who saw little evidence of divine justice in their daily lives. The education that might have provided cowboys with alternatives to their harsh existence was systematically denied by the circumstances of their lives. Schools were rare in frontier regions, and the constant movement required by cowboy work made regular attendance impossible even when schools existed. Many cowboys had received only a few years of formal education before economic necessity forced them into the workforce, leaving them with limited reading and writing skills that further restricted their employment options. The few cowboys who were literate often found that books and newspapers were luxuries they couldn't afford on their meagre wages. Public libraries didn't exist in most frontier towns, and the lending libraries that were sometimes organised by churches or civic groups contained mostly religious texts that offered little practical information for men trying to improve their circumstances. The intellectual stimulation that might have helped cowboys develop new skills or perspectives was simply unavailable to most of them. The cultural activities that enriched life in more settled regions were largely absent from cowboy experience. There were no theatres, no concerts, no art galleries or museums in frontier towns. Entertainment consisted mainly of drinking, gambling and fighting, activities that often caused more problems than they solved. The refinement and cultural education that might have helped cowboys adapt to changing social conditions were foreign concepts in a world where survival was the primary concern. The news of the outside world reached frontier regions slowly, and often in distorted form. Cowboys might learn about major national events weeks or months after they occurred, and then only through second-hand accounts from travellers or outdated newspapers that had made their way west through uncertain postal routes. This isolation from current events made it difficult for cowboys to understand the broader economic and social changes that were affecting their industry and their prospects for the future. The political representation that might have protected cowboy interests was virtually non-existent in territories that had not yet achieved statehood. Even in established states, the scattered nature of cowboy populations and their frequent movement made it difficult for them to organise politically or influence legislation that affected their working conditions. The laws that governed their lives were usually made by people who had never experienced cowboy life and had little understanding of or sympathy for cowboy concerns. The labour organisations that were beginning to form in other industries during the late 19th century had little presence in the cattle business. The scattered nature of cowboy work, the seasonal employment patterns, and the competitive atmosphere that pitted cowboys against each other for scarce jobs made it difficult to organise collective action. Individual cowboys who complained about working conditions or wages were easily replaced by the constant supply of desperate men willing to work under any conditions. The few attempts at cowboy organisation that did occur were usually crushed by ranch owners, who had the support of local law enforcement and political authorities. Cowboys who tried to strike for better wages or working conditions found themselves blacklisted from employment, their reputations destroyed by accusations of being troublemakers or agitators. The isolation and economic desperation that characterized cowboy life made collective action almost impossible to sustain. The technological innovations that were improving working conditions in other industries had little impact on cowboy life. While factory workers were benefiting from improved safety equipment and more efficient production methods, cowboys continued to work with tools and techniques that had changed little in decades. The dangerous nature of their work remained constant, with no safety regulations or protective equipment to reduce the risk of injury or death. The insurance systems that were beginning to provide financial protection for workers in other industries were unknown in the cattle business. Cowboys who were injured on the job had no compensation beyond whatever charity their employers or fellow workers might provide. Disability meant destitution, and death often left families with no means of support. The financial risks of cowboy life extended far beyond the individual worker to include anyone who depended on his income. The banking and financial services that were becoming available in more settled regions were largely absent from frontier areas where cowboys worked. Even when banks existed in frontier towns, they rarely served working-class customers like cowboys. The lack of financial services made it difficult for cowboys to save money, invest in their future, or access credit for emergencies. Most cowboys dealt in cash only, making them vulnerable to theft and leaving them with no financial records or credit history. The transportation systems that were connecting other parts of America were often inaccessible to cowboys because of cost or location. Railroad travel was expensive, and many areas where cowboys worked were far from railroad lines. This transportation isolation made it difficult for cowboys to seek employment in other regions when local opportunities disappeared, trapping them in declining economic areas with few alternatives. The communication technologies that were beginning to link distant parts of the country had little impact on cowboy life. Telegraph lines reached some frontier towns, but the cost of sending messages was prohibitive for men earning cowboy wages. The telephone, which was beginning to appear in eastern cities, was unknown in most areas where cowboys worked. This communication isolation meant that cowboys often learned about job opportunities or family emergencies long after timely action could have made a difference. The consumer goods that were becoming available to Americans in more prosperous regions were luxuries that most cowboys could never afford. Basic necessities like decent clothing, adequate food, and simple household items consumed most of their income, leaving nothing for the manufactured goods that were beginning to define middle-class American life. Cowboys lived at subsistence level, while the country around them was experiencing unprecedented prosperity. The housing that was available to cowboys in frontier towns was typically substandard and overpriced. Bunkhouses were often little more than crude shelters, with no amenities, while boarding houses charged inflated rates for accommodations that would have been considered unacceptable in more civilized areas. The lack of decent housing options meant that cowboys often lived in conditions that would have been shocking to Americans in more settled regions. The food available in frontier towns was often poor in quality and expensive, taking advantage of cowboys who had limited options and no means of comparison shopping. Restaurants catered to cowboys charged high prices for meals that were often poorly prepared and potentially dangerous to consume. The lack of refrigeration and food safety regulations meant that spoiled or contaminated food was a constant hazard, adding illness to the other risks of cowboy life. The clothing available to cowboys was typically designed more for appearance than functionality, sold by merchants who understood that cowboys wanted to look the part, even if they couldn't afford quality goods. Fancy boots that looked impressive but provided little protection, hats that couldn't withstand frontier weather conditions, and clothing that fell apart after minimal use were common purchases that left cowboys looking authentic while draining their limited resources. The equipment that cowboys needed for their work was often expensive and difficult to obtain in frontier regions. A good saddle could cost several months' wages, while quality horses were even more expensive and harder to find. Cowboys often worked with substandard equipment that increased their risk of injury while reducing their effectiveness as workers. The constant need to repair and replace equipment consumed a significant portion of cowboy income. The veterinary care that might have kept horses healthy and extended their useful life was virtually non-existent in most frontier areas. Cowboys learned to treat their own animals using folk remedies and guesswork, often with poor results. The loss of a horse to preventable illness or injury was a financial disaster that could leave a cowboy unemployed and stranded far from home. The legal protections that were available to workers in other industries were largely absent from cowboy life. There were no safety regulations governing working conditions, no laws protecting workers from employer abuse, and no legal recourse for cowboys who were cheated out of wages or injured through employer negligence. The law generally favoured property owners over workers, leaving cowboys with little protection against exploitation. The social services that were beginning to emerge in more settled areas were unknown in frontier regions where cowboys worked. There were no hospitals for the sick and injured, no poorhouses for the destitute, no orphanages for children whose parents had died or disappeared. Cowboys and their families were entirely dependent on their own resources and whatever informal charity might be available from friends or fellow workers. The educational opportunities that might have helped cowboy children escape the cycle of poverty were virtually non-existent in most frontier areas. Schools, when they existed at all, were often closed for months at a time due to lack of funding or qualified teachers. Children of cowboys frequently received no formal education, ensuring that they would face the same limited opportunities as their parents. The cultural institutions that enriched life in more settled communities were absent from most frontier towns where cowboys worked. Libraries, theatres, musical organisations, and other cultural amenities were luxuries that frontier communities couldn't afford or didn't prioritise. Cowboys lived in cultural isolation, cut off from the intellectual and artistic developments that were shaping American society. The recreational opportunities that were available to workers in other industries were largely absent from cowboy life. Public parks, organised sports, social clubs, and other forms of wholesome recreation were unknown in most frontier areas. Cowboys' leisure time was typically spent in saloons and gambling halls, environments that often led to more problems than they solved. The consumer credit that was beginning to make purchases possible for workers in other industries was rarely available to cowboys, whose irregular income and transient lifestyle made them poor credit risks. Cowboys had to pay cash for everything, limiting their ability to acquire the tools and equipment they needed for their work. The lack of credit also made it difficult for cowboys to invest in their future or take advantage of opportunities that required initial capital investment. The professional development opportunities that were becoming available in other industries were unknown in cowboy work. There were no training programs, no advancement opportunities, no ways to improve skills or increase earning potential. Cowboys who wanted to advance their careers had to leave the industry entirely, starting over in new fields where their experience counted for nothing. The retirement planning that was beginning to emerge in other industries was entirely absent from cowboy life. Cowboys worked until they could no longer do the job, then faced destitution with no savings, no pension, and no family support system. The few cowboys who managed to survive into old age often ended their lives in poorhouses or on the charity of communities that viewed them as burdens rather than honoured veterans of frontier development. The healthcare that was becoming available in more settled regions remained largely inaccessible to cowboys working in remote frontier areas. When medical care was available, it was often provided by practitioners with questionable credentials and limited supplies. Cowboys learned to treat their own injuries and illnesses, often with tragic results that could have been prevented with proper medical attention. The working conditions that cowboys endured would have been considered intolerable in other industries, even by the standards of an era not known for worker protection. The combination of dangerous work, harsh environment, poor food, inadequate shelter, and minimal wages created a situation that few men could endure for long without serious physical and psychological damage. The social mobility that was possible in other areas of American society was largely absent from cowboy life. The skills required for cowboy work were highly specialized and not transferable to other occupations, while the low wages and irregular employment made it impossible to accumulate the capital needed to start a business or invest in education. Cowboys were trapped in a cycle of poverty that few could escape. The family stability that was taken for granted by workers in other industries was impossible for most cowboys. The demands of their work required long absences from home, while the low wages and uncertain employment made it difficult to support a family. Many cowboys never married, not by choice, but because no responsible woman would tie her future to such uncertain prospects. The community connections that provided support and meaning for workers in other industries were largely absent from cowboy life. The transient nature of their work meant that cowboys rarely stayed in one place long enough to develop lasting relationships or become part of stable communities. They lived as perpetual outsiders, welcome nowhere and belonging to no place. The political influence that workers in other industries were beginning to exercise was unknown among cowboys. Their scattered distribution, frequent movement, and lack of organization made collective political action impossible. The laws that governed their lives were made by people who had never experienced cowboy work and had little understanding of or sympathy for cowboy concerns. The economic security that was becoming possible for workers in other industries remained a distant dream for cowboys. The seasonal nature of their work, combined with low wages and high living costs, made it impossible to build savings or plan for the future. Cowboys lived from paycheck to paycheck, always one injury or economic downturn away from destitution. The technological progress that was improving conditions for workers in other industries had little impact on cowboy life. The tools and techniques of cowboy work remained essentially unchanged from earlier decades, offering no relief from the physical demands and dangers of the job. While other American workers were benefiting from industrial innovation, cowboys continued to work under conditions that their grandfathers would have recognized. The professional respect that was accorded to skilled workers in other industries was largely absent from cowboy life. Cowboys were viewed by respectable society as little better than drifters and troublemakers, men whose rough appearance and violent reputation made them unwelcome in polite company. The skills they possessed were not recognized as valuable by a society that was moving toward more civilized forms of economic activity. The personal relationships that cowboys managed to form were often superficial and temporary, born more of shared misery than genuine affection. Men thrown together by circumstance rather than choice learned to cooperate for survival, while maintaining emotional distance that protected them from the inevitable pain of separation. Trust was could afford when a luxury that few today's partner might be tomorrow's competitor for the same job, the same woman, or the same bottle of whiskey. The constant exposure to violence and death created a callousness among cowboys that shocked visitors from more civilized regions. Men who had seen friends trampled by cattle, struck by lightning, or shot down in saloon fights developed an emotional numbness that served as protection against psychological trauma, but also cut them off from normal human empathy. They learned to step over bodies, to continue working while companions suffered, to accept death as just another inconvenience in an already inconvenient life. The gambling that provided one of the few forms of entertainment available to cowboys was rarely the skillful card play depicted in popular fiction. Most cowboys were poor players, who lost their wages to professional gamblers, who followed the cattle trails like vultures, setting up operations in every town where trail drives ended. The games were often rigged, the drinks were watered down to keep players conscious longer, and the women who provided companionship were usually working with the house to separate cowboys from whatever money they had left. Even when cowboys won at gambling, their victories were often temporary. A man who struck it lucky at poker one night might find himself robbed, cheated, or simply too drunk to remember where he put his winnings by morning. The saloon owners, gambling house operators, and other predators who fed off cowboy wages had developed systems that ensured money flowed in only one direction, from the pockets of working men into the coffers of those who exploited their desperation. The alcohol that cowboys consumed in legendary quantities was often barely fit for human consumption, distilled from whatever materials were available and flavoured with additives that were sometimes more dangerous than the alcohol itself. Frontier whiskey might contain anything from tobacco juice to strychnine, creating a product that could blind, poison, or kill unwary drinkers. Cowboys developed tolerance not just to alcohol, but to the various toxins that came with it, their bodies adapting to regular doses of substances that would hospitalize modern drinkers. The hangovers that followed these drinking sessions were legendary in their severity, leaving cowboys barely able to function during working hours that already demanded peak physical performance. Many cowboys developed chronic alcoholism, not from choice, but from the simple reality that alcohol was often safer to drink than the contaminated water available in frontier towns. The line between medical necessity and addiction was often impossible to draw in an environment where both water and whiskey could kill you. The prostitutes who served cowboy customers were themselves victims of a system that offered few alternatives for women on the frontier. Many had been forced into the profession by economic desperation, family abandonment, or simple lack of other options in communities where respectable work for women was scarce and poorly paid. These women understood that their customers were temporary, that emotional attachment was a luxury neither party could afford, and that survival required treating intimacy as just another business transaction. The diseases that flourished in frontier brothels were a constant threat to both the women who worked there and the cowboys who patronized them. Syphilis, gonorrhea, and other sexually transmitted infections spread rapidly through populations that had no understanding of disease transmission and no effective treatments. Many cowboys carried these infections for years, suffering progressive deterioration of their health while unknowingly spreading disease to other partners. The shame associated with such ailments prevented many from seeking what little medical help was available, allowing infections to progress to stages that caused madness, blindness, and death. The violence that erupted regularly in frontier towns wasn't the romanticized gunfights of legend, but brutal, often senseless affairs that ended with men dead or permanently disabled over trivial matters. Cowboys who had spent months bottling up frustration, anger, and despair would explode into violence at the slightest provocation. Their judgment impaired by alcohol, and their inhibitions destroyed by months of living on the edge of survival. Knives were more common than guns in these fights, creating wounds that were often fatal in an era before antiseptic surgery and antibiotics. The law enforcement that existed in frontier towns was often as corrupt and violent as the criminals it was supposed to control. Town marshals and sheriffs were frequently former gunfighters, gamblers, or even outlaws who had been hired for their willingness to use violence rather than their commitment to justice. These men understood that their job was to protect the business interests that employed them, not to ensure fair treatment for cowboys who were viewed as necessary nuisances rather than citizens deserving protection. The courts that supposedly provided justice in frontier communities were often kangaroo affairs, where verdicts were predetermined by local politics and economic interests. A cowboy accused of a crime against a prominent businessman or landowner could expect little mercy, while crimes committed against cowboys by respectable citizens were often overlooked entirely. The law was a tool of the powerful rather than a protection for the weak, and cowboys quickly learned that their best chance for justice lay in their own hands rather than in legal institutions. The jails that housed cowboys awaiting trial or serving sentences were typically hellholes that made the worst conditions of trail life seem luxurious by comparison. Overcrowded, unsanitary, and often unheated, frontier jails were breeding grounds for disease and violence. Men were chained together in common cells where the strong preyed on the weak, where disease spread rapidly through crowded conditions, and where death was often preferable to prolonged imprisonment. The medical care that was theoretically available in frontier towns was often provided by practitioners whose qualifications were questionable at best. Many frontier doctors were failed physicians who had fled east to escape malpractice accusations, drunks who could no longer maintain practices in civilized areas, or simply desperate men who had assumed medical titles without any formal training. Surgery was performed without anesthesia using instruments that were rarely sterilized, often in conditions that would have shocked veterinarians treating livestock. The medications available on the frontier were largely ineffective and often dangerous, consisting mainly of patent medicines that contained varying amounts of alcohol, opium, and other substances that provided temporary relief, while often causing long-term addiction or poisoning. Cowboys who sought medical treatment for injuries or illnesses often emerged worse than when they entered, their conditions complicated by infections, drug reactions, or simply incompetent treatment from practitioners who had no business calling themselves doctors. The dental care available to cowboys was limited to extraction, usually performed by blacksmiths, barbers, or anyone else willing to grip a pair of pliers and pull. There was no anesthesia beyond whiskey, no antiseptic technique, and no follow-up care for the infections that often resulted from these crude procedures. Many cowboys died from infected tooth sockets, while others lived with chronic abscesses that caused constant pain and gradually poisoned their systems. The nutrition that cowboys received was so poor that malnutrition was virtually universal among men working the cattle trails. Scurvy, beriberi, and other deficiency diseases were common, causing symptoms that ranged from bleeding gums and loose teeth to nerve damage and heart problems. The monotonous diet of beans, hardtack and salt pork provided barely enough calories to sustain heavy physical labour, but lacked most of the vitamins and minerals necessary for health. The water that cowboys consumed on the trail was often contaminated with bacteria, parasites and chemical pollutants that caused chronic digestive problems and periodic outbreaks of dysentery, cholera and other waterborne diseases. Clean water was so rare that cowboys learned to drink whatever was available, developing tolerance to contaminants that would incapacitate men from more sanitary environments. Many cowboys suffered from chronic diarrhea, stomach cramps, and other digestive ailments that sapped their strength and made already difficult work even harder to endure. The sanitation that was taken for granted in more civilized areas was non-existent on cattle drives and barely adequate in frontier towns. Cowboys went weeks without bathing, their bodies layered with dirt, sweat, and the accumulated filth of trail life. Their clothing became stiff with dried perspiration and embedded grime, chafing against skin that never had a chance to heal properly. Lice, fleas, and other parasites were constant companions, adding to the misery of men who already faced more discomfort than most humans could endure. The sleep that cowboys managed to get was rarely restful, interrupted by weather, animals, guard duties, and the constant discomfort of sleeping on hard ground with inadequate bedding. Chronic sleep deprivation was universal among trail hands, affecting their judgment, reflexes, and emotional stability in ways that increased the already considerable dangers of their work. Men who were exhausted beyond endurance were expected to make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death for themselves and their companions. The isolation that characterized cowboy life extended beyond physical separation, from civilization to include emotional and psychological alienation from normal human experience. Cowboys developed a stoic acceptance of suffering that served them well in their harsh environment, but made it difficult for them to relate to people who hadn't shared their experiences. They became strangers to their own families, unable to communicate the realities of their lives to people who lived in a completely different world. The aging process was particularly cruel to men whose bodies had been broken down by years of physical abuse in harsh conditions. Cowboys in their 30s often moved like men twice their age, their joints swollen with arthritis, their backs permanently bent from years in the saddle, their hands gnarled from rope burns and repetitive motion injuries. The accumulated damage of cowboy life created disabilities that made continued work impossible, while offering no alternatives for men whose skills were too specialized to transfer to other occupations. The mental health problems that resulted from cowboy life were neither recognized nor treated in an era that had little understanding of psychological trauma. Depression was common among men who lived in constant discomfort with little hope for improvement, but it was viewed as a character weakness rather than a medical condition. Anxiety, post-traumatic stress, and other psychological disorders were simply accepted as part of life, leaving cowboys to cope with their demons using whatever methods they could devise. The suicide rate among cowboys was significantly higher than among other occupations, though exact statistics are difficult to determine because many deaths were recorded as accidents rather than deliberate self-harm. Men who could no longer endure the physical pain, emotional isolation, and economic hopelessness of their lives often chose death over continued suffering, sometimes arranging their demise to look accidental so their families wouldn't face the additional burden of shame that accompanied suicide. The family relationships that might have provided emotional support were often damaged beyond repair by the demands of cowboy life. Parents who had sacrificed to give their sons better opportunities watched helplessly as those sons destroyed their health and prospects in pursuit of romantic dreams that bore no resemblance to reality. Siblings drifted apart as cowboys became unable to relate to family members who lived conventional lives in settled communities. The marriages that cowboys attempted were usually doomed by practical considerations that had nothing to do with love or compatibility. Women who married cowboys faced lives of poverty, uncertainty, and frequent widowhood, while their husbands struggled with the competing demands of dangerous work and family responsibilities. The divorce rate among cowboy families was high, though many separations were informal arrangements that left women and children without legal protection or financial support. The children who grew up in cowboy families often faced lives of hardship that made their fathers' experiences seem comfortable by comparison. Raised in poverty by mothers who struggled to survive on irregular income, these children frequently entered the workforce while still young, their education cut short by economic necessity. Many boys followed their fathers into cowboy work, perpetuating the cycle of suffering that had trapped their families for generations. The communities that developed around the cattle industry were often as harsh and unforgiving as the work itself, populated by people who'd been hardened by frontier life into callous indifference toward human suffering. Compassion was a luxury that few could afford when survival required constant vigilance and ruthless competition for scarce resources. Cowboys found little sympathy or support from communities that viewed them as necessary evils rather than valued citizens. The economic system that employed cowboys was designed to extract maximum profit from their labour while providing minimum compensation and protection. Ranch owners and cattle companies viewed cowboys as expendable resources, easily replaced when they wore out or became troublesome. The boom and bust cycles that characterised the cattle industry created periods of unemployment that left thousands of cowboys stranded without work or resources in remote locations far from any alternative employment. The technological changes that were transforming American society during the late 19th century largely bypassed the frontier regions where cowboys worked, leaving them increasingly isolated from the mainstream of American life. While cities in the East were being connected by telegraph lines, electric lights, and railroad networks, cowboys continued to live and work, much as their predecessors had decades earlier, cut off from the innovations that were improving life for other Americans. The political representation that might have protected cowboy interests was virtually non-existent in territories and states where the cattle industry was concentrated. Cowboys were too scattered, too mobile, and too disorganized to exert political influence, while their employers had the resources and connections to ensure that legislation favored business interests over worker welfare. The laws that governed cowboy life were made by people who had never experienced the realities of frontier work and had little sympathy for those who did. The social mobility that was possible in other areas of American society was largely absent from the cattle industry, where the skills required for advancement were either unavailable to working cowboys or irrelevant to their daily survival. A cowboy might become a trail boss or ranch foreman through years of experience, but these positions offered little improvement in working conditions or long-term security. The vast majority of cowboys remained common labourers throughout their careers, with no prospect of significant advancement or increased earning potential. The education that might have provided alternatives to cowboy work was systematically denied by the circumstances of frontier life. Schools were rare in cattle country, and the constant movement required by trail work made regular attendance impossible, even when educational opportunities existed. Most cowboys remained functionally illiterate throughout their lives, unable to read contracts, write letters, or access the information that might have helped them improve their situations. The cultural isolation that characterized frontier life cut cowboys off from the intellectual and artistic developments that were enriching American society during the late 19th century. Literature, music, theatre, and other forms of cultural expression were unknown luxuries in most areas where cowboys worked, leaving them without the mental stimulation that might have provided relief from the grinding monotony of their daily existence. The consumer goods that were becoming available to other Americans remained out of reach for cowboys, whose wages barely covered basic survival needs. While middle-class families in eastern cities were purchasing manufactured goods that made life more comfortable and convenient, cowboys continued to make do with crude, handmade equipment that was often inadequate for the demanding work they performed. The banking and financial services that were becoming available in more settled areas were largely absent from frontier regions, making it impossible for cowboys to save money, invest futures, or access credit for emergencies. Most cowboys dealt entirely in cash, making them vulnerable to theft and leaving them without the financial resources needed to escape their circumstances when opportunities arose. The transportation networks that were connecting other parts of America often bypassed the remote areas where cowboys worked, leaving them isolated from job opportunities in other regions and unable to escape declining local economies. When the cattle industry began its inevitable decline, many cowboys found themselves trapped in economically depressed areas with no means of reaching places where work might be available. The communication systems that were linking distant parts of the country had little impact on cowboy life, leaving them cut off from news of the outside world and unable to maintain contact with family and friends in other regions. Letters took weeks or months to reach their destinations, assuming they arrived at all, while telegrams were expensive luxuries that few cowboys could afford. The healthcare systems that were developing in American cities remained largely inaccessible to cowboys working in remote frontier areas, leaving them dependent on primitive folk remedies and dangerous self-treatment for injuries and illnesses that could have been easily treated with proper medical care. The lack of medical facilities meant that minor problems often became major disabilities, while serious injuries were frequently fatal. The insurance and pension systems that were beginning to provide financial security for workers in other industries were unknown in the cattle business, leaving cowboys without protection against the economic consequences of injury, illness, or old age. A cowboy who became unable to work faced immediate destitution, with no safety net beyond whatever charity might be available from former employers or fellow workers. The working conditions that cowboys endured would have been considered intolerable in other industries, even by the standards of an era not known for worker protection. The combination of dangerous work, harsh environment, poor food, inadequate shelter, and minimal wages created a situation that broke most men physically and psychologically within a few years of entering the profession. The professional development opportunities that were available in other industries were non-existent in cowboy work, where skills were learned through painful experience rather than formal training. There were no advancement programs, no educational opportunities, and no ways to improve earning potential beyond the slow accumulation of experience that might eventually lead to slightly better positions with marginally improved working conditions. The retirement planning that was becoming possible for workers in other industries was entirely absent from cowboy life, where men worked until they could no longer perform the job and then faced destitution with no savings, no pension, and no family support system. The few cowboys who managed to survive into old age often ended their lives as objects of charity rather than honoured veterans of frontier development. The social respect that was accorded to skilled workers in other industries was largely denied to cowboys, who were viewed by respectable society as rough, dangerous men whose violent reputation made them unwelcome in polite company. The skills they possessed were not recognised as valuable by a society that was moving toward more civilised and settled forms of economic activity. The community for workers' connections that provided support and meaning in other industries were impossible for cowboys, whose work required constant movement and whose appearance and rough reputation made them unwelcome in rest-lived acceptable society. They circumstances, the family for granted by acceptance only among their desperate outsiders, belonging others who share workers in other industries, was impossible perpetual stability that was taken to no community, and finding for most cowboys, whose work demanded long absences and whose uncertain income made it difficult to support dependents. Many cowboys never married, not by choice but because her future to such no responsible woman would tie uncertain and dangerous prospects. The economic security that was becoming available to workers in other industries remained a distant dream for cowboys, whose seasonal employment, low wages and high living costs made it impossible to accumulate savings or plan for the future. They lived constantly on the edge of destitution, always one injury or economic downturn away from complete disaster. The political influence that workers in other industries were beginning to exercise was unknown among cowboys, whose scattered distribution and lack of organisation made collective action impossible. The laws that governed their lives were made by people who had never experienced cowboy work and who viewed cowboys as expendable resources rather than citizens deserving protection. The technological progress that was improving conditions for workers in other industries had little impact on cow, and techniques remained essentially boy life, where the tools unchanged from earlier generations. While other American workers were benefiting from industrial innovation, cowboys continued to work under conditions that offered no relief from the physical demands and dangers that had always characterized their profession. The consumer credit that was becoming available to workers in other industries was rarely accessible to cowboys, whose irregular made them income and transient lifestyle poor credit risks in the eyes of merchants and lenders. Cowboys had to pay cash for everything, limiting their ability to acquire the equipment they needed and making it impossible to take advantage of opportunities that required initial investment. The legal protections that were beginning to emerge for workers in other industries were largely absent from cowboy life, where there were no safety regulations, no laws protecting workers from employer abuse, and no legal recourse for those who were cheated out of wages or injured through employer negligence. Cowboys were left to protect themselves in a system that generally favoured property owners over labourers. The social services that were developing in more settled areas were unknown in the frontier regions where cowboys worked, leaving them entirely dependent on their own resources when faced with illness, injury, or unemployment. There were no hospitals, no poorhouses, no organised charity beyond whatever informal help might be available from friends or fellow themselves workers who were struggling to survive. The educational opportunities that might have helped cowboy children escape the cycle of poverty were virtually non-existent in most frontier areas, where schools were rare and often closed for months at a time due to lack of funding or qualified teachers. Children of cowboys frequently received no formal education, ensuring that they would face the same limited opportunities that had trapped their parents. The cultural institutions that enriched life in more settled communities were absent from most areas where cowboys worked, leaving them without access to libraries, theatres, or other sources of intellectual stimulation that might have provided relief from the monotony of their daily existence. Cowboys lived in cultural isolation, cut off from the artistic and intellectual developments that were shaping American society. The recreational opportunities that provided relief from monotony in other professions were virtually non-existent for cowboys trapped in a world where entertainment meant risking what little money they had on rigged games or poisonous alcohol. While factory workers in eastern cities could attend concerts, visit parks, or join social clubs after their shifts ended, cowboys faced endless hours of mind-numbing boredom, broken only by moments of terror when cattle stampeded or weather turned deadly. The few diversions available on the trail were pathetic substitutes for genuine recreation. Cowboys might pass time by carving crude figures from wood scraps, playing simple card games with decks so worn the suits were barely recognizable, or engaging in practical jokes that often bordered on cruelty. These pranks weren't harmless fun, but expressions of frustration and desperation, ways of asserting dominance, or simply feeling something other than the crushing monotony that defined their existence. Music, when it existed at all, was utilitarian rather than artistic. Cowboys sang to cattle not for the joy of it, but because the sound kept the animals calm during night watches. These weren't melodious ballads, but droning, repetitive chants designed to be as boring as possible, lullabies for livestock that reflected the dreary reality of cowboy life, rather than the romantic image later created by Hollywood songwriters who had never spent a sleepless night circling a restless herd. The storytelling that supposedly flourished around campfires was more often complaints about working conditions, boasts about past exploits that grew more elaborate with each telling, or bitter observations about the futility of their circumstances. Men too exhausted to think clearly would mumble half-coherent tales while staring into dying fires, their narratives trailing off into silence as speakers fell asleep, mid-sentence, or simply ran out of energy to continue speaking. Reading was impossible for the majority of cowboys who couldn't decipher written words, and even those with basic literacy skills found books to be expensive luxuries that were impractical to carry on long drives. The few publications that reached frontier towns were usually outdated newspapers or sensationalized dime novels that bore no resemblance to actual cowboy experience, creating a cruel irony where the very men living these hardships couldn't access the romanticized versions of their own lives. The philosophical discussions that might have provided intellectual stimulation were rare among men whose education had ended in childhood and whose daily concerns centered on immediate survival rather than abstract concepts. Cowboys developed a practical fatalism that accepted suffering without seeking deeper meaning, a worldview shaped by harsh experience rather than contemplative thought. The artistic expression that enriched other working-class communities was largely absent from cowboy culture, where survival took precedence over creativity, and there were no materials or leisure time for artistic pursuits. The decorative elements that appeared on cowboy equipment served functional purposes rather than aesthetic ones, with any beauty being incidental to utility rather than intentionally created for its own sake. The social rituals that bound other communities together were replaced in cowboy life by crude hierarchies based on experience, toughness, and the to endure hardship without complaint. Newcomers were hazed mercilessly, not as good-natured initiation, but as brutal tests that often drove men away before they could learn the skills needed to survive. The camaraderie celebrated in cowboy mythology was more often mutual tolerance born of shared misery than genuine friendship. The holidays and celebrations that marked the passage of time in settled communities were largely ignored on cattle drives, where work continued regardless of calendar dates, and there were no resources for festive activities. Christmas might pass unnoticed, except for slightly better food, if supplies permitted, while birthdays were forgotten entirely in a world where survival from day to day was achievement enough. The personal hygiene standards that were maintained by workers in other industries became impossible luxuries for cowboys who went weeks without access to clean water, soap, or privacy for washing. The accumulated filth wasn't just uncomfortable, but dangerous, creating breeding grounds for disease and infection that added to the already considerable health risks of frontier life. The clothing that cowboys wore became extensions of their suffering rather than protection from it. Garments stiffened with dried sweat and embedded dirt chafed against skin that never had opportunity to heal, while boots designed for mounted work became instruments of torture during long hours on foot. The iconic cowboy attire celebrated in popular culture was in reality a collection of ill-fitting, poorly maintained gear that added to, rather than alleviated, the discomforts of the profession. The equipment maintenance that consumed precious rest time was another source of constant frustration for men whose tools were their lifelines, but who lacked the resources to properly care for them. Saddles cracked in dry heat and rotted in wet weather, ropes frayed from overuse, and metal tools rusted despite efforts to keep them oiled. Cowboys spent hours each day repairing gear that was destined to fail at critical moments, knowing that equipment failure could mean death but lacking alternatives. The weather that cowboys faced wasn't just uncomfortable, but actively hostile to human survival, creating conditions that modern meteorologists would consider unsurvivable. Temperature swings of 50 degrees within hours tested human endurance beyond reasonable limits, while storms brought hail that could kill cattle and lightning that turned metal equipment into deadly conductors of electricity. The dust storms that swept across the plains created apocalyptic conditions where visibility dropped to zero and breathing became a struggle for survival. Cowboys learned to recognize the signs of approaching storms and seek whatever shelter they could find. But often there was nowhere to hide from walls of dust that stretched from ground to sky and lasted for hours or even days. So there you have it, the brutal, unvarnished truth about cowboy life stripped of its romantic veneer. These weren't the noble heroes of Hollywood legend, but desperate men trapped in a system that chewed them up and spat them out broken, diseased and forgotten. The dust has settled on their graves, the cattle trails have been ploughed under for farmland, and the towns that once separated them from their wages have either disappeared entirely or transformed into quiet agricultural communities that barely remember the suffering that built them. Next time you see a cowboy movie or read a Western novel, remember the real story. Remember the men who died choking on dust, who froze to death in line camps, who drank themselves into early graves trying to forget what they'd endured. Their legacy isn't romance or adventure, but a stark reminder of how mythology can obscure the most basic human truths about work, survival, and the price of progress.